5:30 in the afternoon on the 12th of March, 2026. The USS Ronald Reagan was steaming at 22 knots through the Philippine Sea, unaware that it was currently occupying a point in space and time that would soon become a graveyard of steam and fire. The carrier strike group was operating under a deceptive calm, yet every sensor in the fleet was vibrating with the ghost of a threat that had not yet materialized on any radar screen. How could a single ballistic calculation, launched from 1,000 kilometers away, transform a sovereign piece of American steel into a mere coordinate for a finished experiment? The Pacific water was a deep, bruised purple, under the fading light of a low sun, smelling of salt spray and the faint, metallic tang of jet fuel. The air was heavy, with a humidity that seemed to stick to the gray hull, a silent witness to the invisible lines being drawn across the deep. The USS Ronald Reagan, 100,000 tons of American diplomacy and kinetic potential, sliced through the swells at coordinates 20 degrees north, 130 degrees east. To the sailors on the flight deck, the world felt vast and permanent. A world governed by the rhythm of launching F-35 Bravo fighters and the steady hum of nuclear reactors deep within the ship's belly. They did not know that in a darkened command center in the heart of mainland China, a series of digits had already been entered into a targeting computer that would define the next century of human conflict. The DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missile did not care about the history of the United States Navy or the prestige of the 7th Fleet. It only cared about the mathematical intersection of velocity and geography. 6 hours later, long after the USS Ronald Reagan had moved 25 miles further to the east, the sky above that empty patch of ocean would be torn asunder by a kinetic energy that defied traditional naval doctrine. The test was a silent declaration of a new reality, where the ocean was no longer a sanctuary but a grid, and every ship was merely a variable in a terminal equation. The Chinese military had not fired a shot at the carrier, but they had fired a shot at the very idea of American naval supremacy, proving that the carrier's path was no longer dictated by the will of its commanding officer, but by the permission of a land-based missile battery. The geopolitical tension between the two superpowers had been simmering for a decade, a slow-boiling broth of trade disputes, territorial claims, and technological espionage that had finally reached the threshold of a spill. Two superpowers drove toward each other like two high-speed trains on the same track, with no brakes, and no one willing to be the first to pull the wheel, each propelled by national interest and by the deeper terror of being seen to flinch. In the quiet corridors of the Pentagon and the Great Hall of the People, men in expensive suits stared at satellite imagery of the impact point, realizing that the margin of error was now zero. The impact point was not just a splash in the water. It was a psychological crater. It was the physical manifestation of the carrier killer myth becoming a reality, a demonstration that the multi-billion-dollar investment of a carrier strike group could be negated by a missile that cost a fraction of the price. The USS Ronald Reagan continued its patrol, its crew still operating under the assumption of safety, but the officers in the Combat Information Center began to feel a new kind of chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. They were being watched by eyes they could not see, tracked by systems that operated at speeds the human mind could not fully comprehend. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the flight deck, the stillness of the Philippine Sea felt predatory. The soldiers were exhausted, eyes sunken and hollow from weeks of high alert status, and a sense of despair moved through the unit like a slow, cold current. A decision had been made in silence, in a room where no one would say the word aloud, and the world was now waiting for the other shoe to drop. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer just a ship. It was a ghost moving through a haunted house of its own making, waiting to see if the next set of coordinates would be its last. The weight of the ocean seemed to press against the carrier's hull, a reminder that in the age of hypersonic precision, even the largest symbols of national power are ultimately just fragile shells of glass and steel floating upon an indifferent abyss. This was not yet a war of blood, but it was already a war of mathematics, where the winner would be the side that could solve the equation of survival before the timer hit zero. The ghost point remained behind them, a boiling patch of seawater that was slowly cooling, leaving only the silence of what might have been. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating presence that filled the secure rooms of both the West Wing and the ancient, gray-walled compounds of the Chinese leadership. For 48 minutes after the ballistic impact, the dedicated communication link between Washington and Beijing, the so-called red phone, had remained terrifyingly still, despite the frantic efforts of technicians on both sides to initiate a protocol of de-escalation. The digital interface sat dark and unresponsive, a mute testament to a bridge that had been burned not by fire, but by the deliberate choice to stop talking while the engines of war were still warming up. In the White House Situation Room, the air was stagnant, smelling of ozone from overclocked processors and the sharp, acidic scent of stale coffee that no one had the appetite to finish. The DF-21 Delta missile had done more than displace several thousand tons of seawater. It had shattered the fragile consensus that had kept the Pacific theater from erupting for over 80 years. This weapon, often whispered about in intelligence briefings as the carrier killer, was the culmination of 3 decades of focused Chinese engineering designed specifically to negate the primary tool of American power projection by turning the carrier's greatest strength, its size, into its fatal flaw. Had watched for years as American carrier strike groups sailed through the Taiwan Strait with impunity. And they had decided, in a series of closed-door sessions of the Central Military Commission, that the era of uncontested American oceans was over. For the American commanders, the technical reality was a bitter pill that tasted of copper and failure, as they realized their Aegis combat systems had only seen the weapon in its terminal phase, far too late to guarantee a successful intercept. The geopolitical context was a tapestry of grievances, woven from trade wars, the fortification of artificial reefs in the South Sea, and a deep-seated nationalist desire to reclaim a perceived rightful place as the hegemon of the Indo-Pacific. 2 massive systems of governance and belief were now grinding against each other with the slow, inevitable force of tectonic plates. And the friction was generating a heat that threatened to melt the very foundations of global stability. Inside the Situation Room, the President of the United States stared at a high-resolution satellite feed of the impact site, where the water was still churning with white foam and debris from the missile's re-entry vehicle. The soldiers and advisors surrounding the table were exhausted, their faces illuminated by the harsh, flickering glow of tactical displays that showed 1,000 different ways the world could end by morning. There was a profound sense of the Thucydides trap hanging over the room, the historical pattern where a rising power and an established power are drawn into a conflict that neither truly wants, but neither can figure out how to avoid. The history of the red lines had been blurred by years of strategic ambiguity, where each side had tested the other's resolve with small provocations that had slowly escalated into this moment of terminal clarity. Beijing viewed the presence of the USS Ronald Reagan, of a colonial past, an unwanted sentinel standing guard over waters that they claimed as their own sovereign territory by historical right. Washington, conversely, viewed the carrier as the guarantor of the freedom of navigation, a vital defender of an international order that allowed the global economy to function without the interference of regional bullies. As the clock ticked toward the 1-hour mark of silence, the psychological toll on the decision-makers became visible in the way they slumped in their chairs or stared blankly at the walls, their minds racing through 1,000 permutations of what comes next. The realization was dawning, on both sides, that once the first ballistic missile is fired in a test of such magnitude, the logic of the laboratory is replaced by the logic of the battlefield, where every action demands a reaction to maintain the appearance of strength. A decision made in silence, in a room where no one would say the word war aloud, was already manifesting in the movement of thousands of troops and the spooling up of jet engines across the Pacific. The silent hotline represented a failure of the human element in a world increasingly governed by automated systems and hypersonic speeds, where the time required for a leader to think was being outpaced by the time required for a missile to strike. The Pacific was no longer a vast expanse that provided a buffer of days and weeks. It had been compressed by technology into a shooting gallery, where the margin for error was measured in seconds. The silence on the line was the most dangerous sound in the world, a void that was rapidly being filled by the assumptions and fears of men who had been trained since birth to never be the one who blinked first. By the time the sun began to rise over the Potomac, the silence had become a message in itself, a declaration that the time for words had passed and the time for the steel bridge of logistics and firepower had begun. The USS Ronald Reagan was still steaming through the deep purple swells of the Philippine Sea, but it was no longer sailing through a world that made sense to its crew or its commanders. They were now the centerpiece of a grim, unfolding drama where the script was being written in real time by the path of ballistic trajectories and the cold, unblinking eyes of surveillance satellites. The transition from a routine presence mission to a state of total combat readiness did not happen with a single loud command, but through 1,000 quiet, synchronized adjustments that rippled through the hull of every ship in the strike group. By 6 in the evening, the 7th Fleet had ceased to be an instrument of diplomatic signaling and had transformed into Battle Force Zulu, a predatory formation of steel and sensors. Designed for the sole purpose of surviving a high-intensity kinetic exchange, the USS Ronald Reagan was no longer sailing a predictable path. It was now the centerpiece of a shifting geometric puzzle, surrounded by an iron shroud of escorts that moved with a lethal, choreographed grace across the darkening waters. The deck of the carrier vibrated with a different frequency now, a low thrumming urgency that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly into the marrow of the sailor's bones, while the air above the flight deck grew sharp with the smell of scorched ozone and the heavy, sulfurous breath of idling jet engines. At the outer edges of the formation, the destroyer DDG-51 and its sister ships pushed 5 miles ahead of the main body, their AN/SPY-6 radars sweeping the horizon in a frantic search for any ballistic or cruise missile signatures that might be screaming toward them at 5 times the speed of sound. To the starboard side of the carrier, the cruiser CG-73 maintained a steady station. Its Mark 41 vertical launch system, loaded with a mix of Standard Missile 3 and Standard Missile 6 interceptors, each one a multi-million-dollar insurance policy against a sky that had suddenly become hostile. The tactical officers in the Combat Information Center worked in a dim, blue-lit world where the only reality was the glowing icons on their screens, their faces pale and drawn, as they calculated intercept geometries and sensor coverage gaps. The strike group was currently maneuvering over the northern edge of the Philippine Trench, a place where the ocean floor dropped away into a jagged abyss nearly 10,000 meters deep, creating a cold, pressurized silence that felt as heavy as the threat of the missiles above. This deep water was a tactical necessity, providing a complex acoustic environment that favored the American sonar technicians over the Chinese attack submarines that were undoubtedly lurking in the thermoclines, waiting for the telltale signature of a carrier's 4 massive propellers. The depth beneath them was 5 miles of crushing, lightless weight, a reminder that the graveyard for these ships would not be a beach or a shallow reef, but a descent into a darkness from which nothing ever returned. Every sailor on board understood, without being told, that the rules of the ocean had been rewritten in a single afternoon by a missile test that had proved the carrier's vulnerability. The presence mission, the idea that simply appearing over the horizon was enough to deter an adversary, was a relic of a bygone era, replaced now by the cold, hard logic of Battle Force Zulu and the desperate need to remain undetected. The carrier strike group had entered a state of electronic silence, or EMCON, shutting down all non-essential radio and radar emissions to hide their electronic footprint from the constellation of Chinese intelligence satellites passing overhead like silent, unblinking predators. The atmosphere within the ships was one of suppressed terror, masked by the rigorous, repetitive motions of professional duty. Men and women checked and rechecked weapon systems they had only ever used in simulations, their hands moving with a mechanical precision that betrayed the trembling of their hearts. They were no longer the hunters, the masters of the Pacific, who could project power with impunity. They were now the hunted, moving through a landscape of invisible threats where the first warning of an attack would likely be the sound of their own hull tearing open. Despair moved through the lower decks like a slow, cold current, a realization that all the technology in the world could not protect them if the mathematics of the enemy's saturation strike proved to be superior. As the USS Ronald Reagan plowed through the swells, its bow cutting into the water with a rhythmic, heavy thud, the commanding officer stood on the bridge and stared out into the blackness, knowing that his decisions were no longer his own. He was a prisoner of the tactical loop, a man whose entire career had been built on the assumption of American naval dominance, now forced to reckon with the reality that his ship was merely a high-value target in a game of global chess. The Philippine Sea was no longer a highway of commerce. It was a theater of attrition, where the price of admission was measured in the lives of 5,000 sailors and the pride of a nation that had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of the sea. The strike group moved further into the deep, the distance between the ships expanding and contracting like the lungs of a giant beast, each vessel a solitary island of light and steel in a world that was rapidly turning to shadow. This was the quiet before the first exchange, the moment where the strategic pieces have been moved into place and all that remains is the spark that will set the horizon on fire. The deep water of the trench offered no comfort, only a more profound sense of isolation, as the men and women of Battle Force Zulu waited for the next coordinate to be calculated, and for the silence to be broken by the scream of incoming fire. By 8 in the evening, the physical world of steel and salt water had been superseded by an invisible architecture of radiation and noise, a digital fog that descended over the Philippine Sea like a shroud of static. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer merely a ship. It was a ghost, flickering in and out of existence on the enemy's long-range displays, its electronic signature being stretched, muffled, and redirected by a screaming chorus of high-power transmitters. High above the carrier, 4 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare aircraft drifted through the thin, freezing air at 30,000 feet, their engines leaving no visible contrails against the starless sky, while their ALQ-99 jamming pods vomited terabytes of digital garbage into the atmosphere. The pilots sat in a world of neon blue light and high-frequency hums, their eyes burning from the strain of watching data streams that represented a war being fought at the speed of light, where the first casualty was always the truth of a target's location. The primary objective was the suppression of the foreign military over-the-horizon radars, massive steel lattices, located 900 kilometers to the west, that bounced low-frequency radio waves off the ionosphere to sea, over the curvature of the Earth. These radars were the eyes of the ballistic missile batteries, the essential link in the kill chain that allowed a land-based launcher to find a needle in a 1,000-mile haystack of open ocean. The military aircraft worked to create digital cataracts over these eyes, flooding the specific frequencies with a wall of white noise that made the surface of the sea look a churning mess of false echoes and ghost contacts. It was a silent, exhausting duel of algorithms and power outputs. A struggle where the winner was not the side with the biggest gun, but the side with the most sophisticated line of code and the most resilient satellite uplink. But the veil was beginning to tear at the edges as the foreign military began to systematically decapitate the orbital architecture using ground-based lasers and co-orbital interceptors designed to blind or disable surveillance satellites. On the naval warship's flag bridge, the wide-area networking screens began to flicker and freeze, the high-resolution data from the command center replaced by the jagged, terrifying lines of signal interference and lost link warnings. The officers stared at the dying screens with a sense of profound vertigo, realizing that they were being pushed back into a pre-digital era of naval warfare, where they could only see as far as their own radar masts could reach. The air in the compartment was thick, with the smell of hot plastic and the sharp, ionized scent of overworked servers, a sensory reminder that the complexity of their technology was also the source of their greatest vulnerability. This was the War of the Blind, a terrifying phase of superpower conflict where both giants found themselves swinging wildly in a darkened room, unable to distinguish a real threat from a digital hallucination. The soldiers in the electronic warfare suites were exhausted, their minds warped by hours of staring at shifting wave patterns that felt more real than the solid bulkheads of the ship, their hollow eyes reflecting a despair that came from the loss of their primary sense. A decision made in a laboratory 5 years ago was now manifesting as a total collapse of the information space, leaving the commander of the naval warship to wonder if the next blip on his screen was a genuine missile or just a clever lie told by an enemy computer. The loss of the satellite links meant the strike group was now an island in every sense of the word, cut off from the global consciousness that had defined military operations for 40 years and forced to rely on the raw, unrefined instincts of its own sensors. The Pacific was no longer a transparent glass bowl monitored by 1,000 eyes. It had become a black forest once again, where every sound was a potential predator and every silence was a hidden trap waiting to be sprung. The military aircraft continued their lonely vigil, their wings shimmering with the reflected light of the electronic fire they were pouring into the sky. But even they knew that the battery life of their deception was rapidly running out. As the digital veil grew thicker and more chaotic, the boundary between reality and simulation began to dissolve, leaving the men and women of the fleet in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the first physical impact to ground them back in the world of flesh and bone. The electromagnetic spectrum was a battlefield of ghosts and shadows, a place where a nation's pride could be erased by a single burst of interference, and where the silence was more loud than any explosion they had ever heard. The naval warship pushed onward, a blind titan moving through a storm of its own making, while the horizon to the west remained a black, impenetrable wall that held the promise of fire. 9 o'clock in the evening on the 13th of March. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer a solitary hunter moving through the void, but the center of a converging storm that had finally broken. A Chinese Type 55 destroyer, the Nanchang, had shadowed the strike group from a distance of 60 miles for 2 days, a silent observer that had suddenly transitioned from a diplomatic nuisance to a lethal participant. The American carrier felt the first touch of the enemy not through a physical strike, but through a fire control radar lock that washed over the hull like a sudden, freezing draft in a closed room. The tactical reality of two empires had finally reached the point where the weight of their own momentum made a collision the only possible outcome, a tragedy written in the language of high-frequency pulses and predatory intent. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, humid pressure of a tropical front, while the sea below remained a flat, indifferent mirror to the chaos that was about to erupt in the sky. The trigger was squeezed 1,000 miles away from the centers of political power. In the cramped, glowing combat center of the Chinese destroyer, the Type 55 destroyer finally let go of the leash, and a YJ-18 supersonic anti-ship missile shrieked out of its vertical launch cell, a jagged spear of white-hot flame that tore through the salt-thick air and left a trail of toxic, gray smoke hanging over the water. The heat blast from the launch was so intense it scorched the paint on the surrounding deck, a violent birth for a weapon that was designed to do nothing but kill. The missile found the Pate Charlie Poseidon patrol aircraft, which was banking hard in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the electronic tether of the incoming warhead. The warhead punched straight through the center fuselage of the aircraft, the explosion instantly severing the tail section and sending the remains of the cockpit into a violent, spinning descent toward the Black Pacific, where 10 American lives were extinguished in a single, silent flash of orange light. On the flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, the response was a scream of mechanical fury as two FA-18 Gulf Growlers and 4 F-35 Bravo fighters were catapulted into the night, their afterburners bleaching the steel deck white, as they clawed for altitude to avenge the crew members lost in the spray. The sky was left etched with the intersecting lines of dying radar flares and the burning wreckage of the patrol plane, which hit the water with a sound that was swallowed instantly by the rising roar of American jet engines as they moved to intercept the destroyer. This was the first blood of a war that neither side could truly afford to win, a moment where the abstract theories of strategic deterrence were replaced by the visceral reality of burning aluminum and sinking steel. The loss of the Pate Charlie Poseidon was not just a tactical setback, it was a psychological rupture that stripped away the last remaining layers of restraint from the commanders of Battle Force Zulu. In the Combat Information Center of the USS Ronald Reagan, the atmosphere was one of grim, focused intensity, where the grief for their fallen comrades was pushed aside by the mechanical requirements of the next 3 minutes. The ocean between the two forces was now a weapons-free zone, a geography defined not by coordinates, but by the effective range of the missiles currently being programmed for flight. The consequences of this exchange were already radiating outward as the global financial markets began to collapse in anticipation of a total disruption of the Pacific trade routes that sustained the modern world. The soldiers on both sides were now locked into a cycle of escalation that felt more like a law of physics than a human choice, as every death demanded a counterstrike to maintain the honor of the flag. Despair moved through the lower decks of the carrier like a slow, cold current as the realization set in that they were no longer playing a game of chicken, but were instead participants in a grand, historical slaughter. A decision made in the heat of a tactical moment had committed two nations to a path from which there was no honorable retreat, only the slow, grinding attrition of their respective youth. As the FA-18 Gulf Growlers reached their strike positions and began to paint the Chinese destroyer with their own targeting lasers, the horizon to the west was lit by the faint, rhythmic flashes of anti-aircraft fire. This was not the clean, clinical war of the simulations, but a messy, terrifying struggle of flesh and machine in the dark, where the only certainty was the rising body count. The USS Ronald Reagan pushed onward, its bow cutting through the swells with a heavy, relentless thud, while the ghosts of the patrol crew seemed to linger in the humid air of the flight deck. The first exchange was over, but the silence that followed was merely the intake of breath before a much larger scream. 5 days after the first blood was spilled into the deep purple waters of the Philippine Sea, the USS Ronald Reagan was no longer a proud symbol of American global reach, but a hungry, thirsty beast that required a constant, frantic feeding of fuel and munitions to remain among the living. A war between two superpowers is not won merely by the courage of pilots or the precision of sensors, but by the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a supply chain that stretches across thousands of miles of hostile, submarine-infested ocean. The Steel Bridge was the name given to the desperate line of tankers and cargo ships that attempted to keep the carrier strike group operational, a fragile connection of metal and oil that was being hunted by an enemy who understood that a carrier without fuel is merely a 100,000-ton floating target. The air around the replenishment ships was thick with the suffocating smell of diesel fuel and the salt spray of a rising gale, while the horizon remained a gray, indistinct line where the next threat would inevitably appear. The supply vessels executed underway replenishment in 4-meter swells, a terrifying dance of physics where two ships moving in parallel at 15 knots were connected by nothing but high-tension wires and rubber hoses. The supply-class fast combat support ship surged alongside the carrier, its hull groaning under the pressure of the turbulent water trapped between the two massive hulls, while the fuel lines stretched between them like umbilical cords of black rubber. One miscalculation in steering, a single momentary lapse in concentration by a helmsman, would be measured in a catastrophic collision that would leave both vessels crippled and vulnerable to the predators lurking beneath the waves. The deck of the supply ship was a chaotic landscape of moving crates and screaming winches, where transport helicopters performed a constant vertical replenishment, lifting pallets of 500-pound bombs and crates of fresh water from one deck to the other in a blur of rotor wash and spray. This was the less glamorous reality of the war of attrition, where the strategic objective was not the seizure of territory, but the slow, methodical exhaustion of the adversary's industrial capacity and logistical patience. Every missile fired by the military forces represented a high-tech asset that took months to manufacture, yet it could be expended in a single 3-second engagement against a target that cost a fraction of its value. The geopolitical context of this struggle was a realization that the modern world's manufacturing base was heavily tilted toward the mainland, leaving the military fleet to fight a war on the far side of the planet. With a supply line that was increasingly thin and prone to rupture, two massive civilizations were now locked in a contest of endurance, where the winner would be the one whose factories could churn out spare parts and refined fuel faster than the enemy could sink the ships carrying them. The physical toll on the sailors involved in these replenishment operations was a quiet, grinding kind of suffering that left them with sunken eyes and hands that never stopped shaking from the vibration of the deck. They moved like ghosts through the cavernous holds of the supply ships, their minds dulled by 72 straight hours of labor and the constant underlying fear that a torpedo would find their hull while they were tethered to the carrier. Despair moved through the unit like a slow, cold current as they looked at the dwindling stacks of crates and realized that the steel bridge was being pecked away, one sunken freighter at a time. A decision made by a logistics officer in a windowless room in Virginia was now a matter of life and death for 5,000 men and women who were running out of the very things they needed to fight back. Tactically, the strike group was forced to dedicate nearly 40% of its defensive assets just to protecting the replenishment ships, a diversion of power that weakened the carrier's ability to strike at the foreign military mainland or defend itself from saturation attacks. The destroyer and its sister ships were constantly peeling away from the main body to investigate sonar contacts or to escort a lonely tanker through the gap between Guam and the Philippine Sea, leaving the aircraft carrier with fewer eyes and fewer interceptors. The enemy understood this vulnerability perfectly, focusing their submarine efforts on the soft targets of the supply chain rather than the hard target of the carrier itself, knowing that if the lifeblood of fuel and food was cut, the Titan would eventually die on its own. As the sun went down on the 5th day, the refueling hoses were finally disconnected and retracted, the two ships pulling away from each other with a sense of mutual relief that felt like an intake of breath after a long submersion. The aircraft carrier was full of fuel once again, its bunkers holding 3 million gallons of volatile energy, but the steel bridge behind it was shorter and more frayed than it had been when the morning began. The Pacific remained an indifferent witness to this mechanical struggle, a vast and lightless graveyard that was slowly filling with the wreckage of a global economy that had been built on the assumption of permanent peace. The lifeblood of the fleet was flowing for now, but the pulse was growing weaker with every mile they steamed further into the heart of the conflict zone. The Virginia-class submarine USS North Carolina drifted like a prehistoric predator through the freezing, lightless currents of the Philippine Trench, 800 feet below the churning chaos of the surface. The steel hull groaned under a pressure that wanted nothing more than to collapse the ship into a solid block of scrap, a physical weight that mirrored the psychological burden carried by the 134 men enwrapped within its pressurized skin. Somewhere in the vast, acoustic canyon to the west, a Chinese Type 093 Shang-class attack submarine was playing the same lethal game of hide-and-seek, moving through the thermoclines with a silent, murderous intent. Could a ghost kill a ghost in a world where sound was the only form of vision, and a single dropped wrench could be a death sentence for everyone on board? The water outside was a crushing, absolute black, a liquid void, where the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the only light came from the flickering internal displays of the sonar suite. The sonar technicians sat in the green room, their ears covered by heavy headsets, listening to the symphony of the deep with an intensity that bordered on the religious. They were looking for the demon in the noise, the specific mechanical signature of a Chinese reactor pump, or the cavitation of a propeller that would betray the location of the enemy boat. The sonar system processed billions of data points every second, trying to separate the natural clicks of snapping shrimp and the low-frequency songs of distant whales. from the artificial hum of a rival superpower. The air inside the submarine was recycled and thin, smelling of amine, ozone, and the unwashed bodies of sailors who had not seen the sun in 22 days. This was the silent service at its most raw, a war fought in the imagination, and through the interpretation of jagged lines on a waterfall display, where the first ship to make a sound was the first ship to die. The tactical reality of submarine warfare in the 21st century was a grim evolution of the Cold War, where the quietness of the boats had reached a point of near perfection, leaving the outcome of an engagement to the sheer nerves of the commanding officers. The USS North Carolina was currently bottoming, resting its keel near a rugged underwater ridge to mask its acoustic profile against the ambient noise of the trench, a maneuver that required the precision of a diamond cutter and the patience of a stone. Beijing's submarine fleet had grown in both number and sophistication, challenging the long-held American belief that the deep oceans were a private sanctuary for the military forces. Two different philosophies of naval power were now colliding in the silence of the abyss, each side driven by a national imperative to control the underwater choke points that governed the movement of the surface fleets above. The soldiers were exhausted, their faces sallow under the artificial light, their internal clocks shattered by the constant 1-in-3 watch rotations and the lack of a horizon to ground their senses. Despair moved through the boat like a slow, cold current, a realization that if they were hit, there would be no rescue, no life rafts, and no witnesses to their final moments in the dark. A decision made by a sonar supervisor to filter out a specific frequency could be the difference between a successful evasion and a catastrophic hull rupture that would send them all into the trench's 10,000-meter maw. The submarine was a world unto itself, a pressurized tube of high-tech machinery and human fragility that was currently the only thing standing between the USS Ronald Reagan and a torpedo from the deep. The tension broke not with a bang, but with the sharp, metallic chirp of an active sonar ping that hammered against the hull of the naval submarine like a physical blow. The foreign military submarine had found them, or at least found their shadow, and it had decided to abandon the silence for the certainty of a kill. The trigger was squeezed. A supersonic torpedo shrieked out of the enemy tube, its high-speed turbine creating a screaming wall of sound that filled the sonar headsets with a terrifying, rhythmic pulse. The heat from the torpedo's chemical engine began to boil the water in a tiny trail behind it as it raced toward the military boat at 60 knots. The commander of the naval submarine did not hesitate. He ordered the launch of 2 heavy torpedoes in a snapshot response, the heavy weapons punching out of the tubes with a dull, muffled thud that shook the entire frame of the submarine. The 2 steel predators were now connected by thin filaments of guidance wire, a digital umbilical cord that allowed the fire control technicians to steer the torpedoes through the complex thermal layers of the trench. The supersonic warhead punched into the decoy launched by the naval submarine, detonating in a massive, underwater concussive wave that sent a shudder through the military hull so violent it threw men from their stations and cracked the glass on 2 secondary displays. The sea was instantly filled with a churning mess of bubbles and silt, a whiteout of acoustic noise that blinded both boats for 10 agonizing seconds. But the heavy torpedo had found its mark, its active seeker head locking onto the cavitating screws of the foreign military boat and driving straight into the engineering spaces. The detonation was a dull, heavy thump that traveled through the water for 50 miles, followed by the sound of metal tearing, and the horrific, high-pitched screech of high-pressure air escaping a dying hull. Black oil and fragments of high-tensile steel began to settle into the trench, the only markers of a battle that would never appear in any newspaper or official report. The naval submarine turned slowly away from the kill zone, its crew silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of men who had just looked into the abyss and seen it blink. This was not a victory to be celebrated with cheers. It was a grim confirmation that the deep trenches were now a graveyard for both sides, a place where the cost of a mistake was total and the silence was the only survivor. The submarine pushed deeper into the dark, its mission to protect the carrier unchanged, while the ghost of the enemy boat began its long, final descent into the lightless mud of the Philippine Trench. 2 in the morning on the 15th of March, 2026. The sky over the Philippine Sea was a black, velvet void, but the invisible world of the high atmosphere was suddenly crowded with the lethal geometry of 40 ballistic missiles. These weapons, launched in a synchronized sequence from 6 different mobile batteries across the mainland, had reached the apex of their trajectory, and were now beginning their terminal plunge through the ionosphere. The mathematics of a saturation attack were simple and cruel, designed to overwhelm the processing speed of the military defense system by presenting more targets than the interceptors could physically engage in a 20-minute window. In the Combat Information Center of the aircraft carrier, the air was freezing and dry, yet the operators were drenched in a cold sweat that smelled of copper and fear as they watched 40 red diamonds descend toward their position at 8 times the speed of sound. The trigger was squeezed 1,000 miles away, but the manifestation of that choice arrived as a series of sonic booms that cracked like thunder across the dark ocean. From the concrete silos hidden within the desert, 40 ballistic missiles had ignited with a roar that shook the earth, their rocket motors vomiting white fire as they shrieked off the rails. The heat blast from the simultaneous launches was so intense it was detected by infrared satellites as a massive, artificial sun blooming on the surface of the planet, a signal that the era of tactical restraint had been officially incinerated. Each missile carried a maneuverable re-entry vehicle that adjusted its course. In the thin air of the upper atmosphere, a jagged spear of kinetic energy that was now hunting for the specific electronic signature of the military carrier strike group. The first warhead did not hit the carrier, but it found the naval warship, which was positioned 4 miles to the windward side of the main formation. The warhead punched straight through the forward missile deck at a near vertical angle, the sheer kinetic energy of the impact detonating the remaining missile interceptors still inside their vertical launch system. The resulting explosion was a whiteout of light that bleached the sky of all color for 3 full seconds, followed by a shockwave that threw sailors off their feet on ships miles away and compressed the chests of everyone on the open bridge. The naval warship's bow was instantly severed from the rest of the hull. 6,000 tons of steel twisted into a burning sculpture of wreckage that began to sink into the deep purple swells before the sound of the blast had even finished echoing. The aircraft carrier responded not with panic, but with a frantic, automated mechanical fury, as its own close-in weapon systems began to scream, their 6-barreled guns spitting 3,000 rounds per minute into the sky. The deck of the carrier shuddered under the vibration of the guns and the rapid-fire launch of missile interceptors, while the air above the flight deck was torn apart by the intersecting lines of red and white tracer fire. A second missile was intercepted 500 meters above the water, its warhead detonating in a massive fireball that washed the starboard side of the carrier in a wave of searing chemical heat and the sharp, acrid stink of burning propellant. The pilot of a military aircraft attempting an emergency landing was caught in the blast wave. His aircraft wrenched violently to the left until the wing clipped the edge of the flight deck and the jet erupted into a spinning ball of fire that tumbled into the sea. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the cruiser and the burning remains of the fighter jet, a dark curtain that blotted out the stars and left the horizon looking like the entrance to a furnace. The burning pieces of the naval warship were still visible above the waterline when the radio channels of the strike group went into a state of dead silence, every sailor holding their breath as they waited for the second wave of diamonds to appear on their screens. This was the immediate aftermath of the first saturation volley. A moment of profound, ringing stillness where the only sound was the crackling of fire and the desperate, overlapping voices of the damage control teams trying to save their ship. The defense had held, but the cost was a cruiser and 80 lives, and the math of the remaining 30 missiles was still ticking down toward a zero that no one wanted to see. The geopolitical consequences of this exchange were already manifesting as a total collapse of the international maritime insurance market and a terrifying realization in every world capital that the Pacific was now a restricted zone of fire. 2 superpowers were locked in a cycle of destruction where the only way to protect one's assets was to destroy the adversary's capability to see them. a logic that was leading both sides toward a total blindness. The soldiers on the aircraft carrier were beyond exhaustion now. Their minds operating on a level of raw, animal survival where the only reality was the next radar sweep and the next interceptor launch. Despair moved through the lower decks like a cold, heavy fog, a feeling that they were no longer fighting for a cause, but were simply participants in a grand, mechanical slaughter that had no exit strategy. As the second wave of missiles began their final approach, the sky was lit by the faint, rhythmic flashes of the naval warship, firing its last remaining missile interceptors into the dark. This was not a battle of heroes, but a battle of exhaustion, where the side that could endure the most suffering without breaking would be the one to inherit a scorched and empty ocean. The aircraft carrier turned hard to port, its engines screaming as it attempted to present the smallest possible target to the incoming fire. While the flight deck was cleared of all non-essential personnel, the iron radius of the carrier's defense was shrinking with every missile that penetrated the outer screen, and the weight of the coming impact was a physical pressure that everyone on board could feel in their very bones. 6 in the morning on the 16th of March, 2026, the USS Ronald Reagan was listing 3 degrees to port, a slow, heavy lean that felt like the ship itself was trying to lie down and surrender to the weight of the Pacific. The morning arrived not with a triumphant sunrise, but with a gradual, gray thickening of the light that revealed a fleet of ghosts, drifting across a sea the color of cold iron. For those on the flag bridge, the world had shrunk to the size of a few flickering monitors and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the emergency generators struggling to keep the ship's vital organs alive. The air in the command center was stagnant, a thick soup of recycled oxygen, the sharp chemical bite of fire suppressant, and the unwashed exhaustion of men and women who had forgotten the taste of sleep. Admiral Miller stood at the forward windows of the bridge, his hands gripped so tightly on the brass railing that his knuckles were the color of bleached bone against the gray paint. He looked out over the flight deck, where the scorched remains of an FA-18 fighter were being pushed into the sea by a deck tractor, a multi-million-dollar funeral for a pilot whose name would soon be added to a list that was growing too long to comprehend. The weight of command was no longer an abstract concept of leadership or strategy, but a physical pressure that seemed to compress his spine with every report of a lost ship or a mounting casualty count. He was the steward of 5,000 lives and the prestige of the United States Navy, yet he felt like a man standing on a crumbling cliff, watching the tide pull the very foundation of his world into the abyss. This was the psychological apex of the war of attrition. The moment where the strategic objectives began to dissolve into a singular, desperate desire for the killing to stop, regardless of the political cost. In Washington and Beijing, the leaders were beginning to realize that they had unleashed a machine that they no longer knew how to switch off, a mechanical monster fed by national pride and the terror of being seen to flinch first. The Thucydides trap had closed its iron jaws, and the two superpowers were now like two exhausted prize-fighters leaning against each other. In the 12th round, too tired to strike, but too proud to fall. The geopolitical tension that had started the conflict was being replaced by a deep, hollow despair. A realization that neither side could achieve a total victory without the total destruction of the global civilization. They both claimed to lead. Below the decks of the USS Ronald Reagan, the soldiers moved through the passageways with sunken eyes and hollow expressions, their movements dictated by a muscle memory that had outlived their conscious will to fight. The smell of grease, stale sweat, and scorched insulation hung in the air like a physical presence, a sensory reminder of the ship's struggle to remain a functioning weapon of war. Despair moved through the lower decks like a slow, cold current. As the sailors looked at the empty racks in the berthing areas and realized that their friends were never coming back from the dark waters of the Philippine Trench, a decision made in a silent room in a distant capital had become a living nightmare for 20-year-olds who had joined the Marine Corps to see the world, only to find that the world was a place of fire and sinking steel. Tactically, the 7th Fleet was reaching a point of diminishing returns where the expenditure of interceptors and fuel was outpacing any possible strategic gain they could hope to achieve by staying in the theater. The admiral knew that if another saturation volley of ballistic missiles was launched, the remaining escorts of Battle Force Zulu would not have enough magazines to protect the carrier. They were fighting for time, but time was a resource that was rapidly being depleted by the industrial capacity of the mainland and the predatory efficiency of their missile batteries. The carrier was a titan that had been bled by 1,000 small cuts, and while it was still standing, its strength was a hollow shell that any determined strike could now shatter. As the gray light of morning finally fully illuminated the wreckage-strewn sea, the silence between the ships felt heavier than the explosions of the night before. This was not the silence of peace, but the dead silence between reloads. A pause in the music of destruction that allowed the participants to hear the beating of their own terrified hearts. The admiral turned away from the window, unable to look at the empty space where the cruiser CG-73 had steamed just 24 hours ago, and walked back toward the tactical displays. He understood, with a clarity that felt like a knife in the chest, that his next order would not be one of victory, but of survival, and that the history of the Pacific was being rewritten in the blood of his sailors. The USS Ronald Reagan pushed onward through the swells, its list to port a visible scar of the violence it had endured, a floating monument to a superpower's refusal to accept its own vulnerability. The weight of command was the realization that in a war between two giants, there are no winners, only survivors who are too exhausted to remember why they started fighting in the first place. The Iron Horizon was waiting for them, a line of fire and shadow that marked the edge of the world they knew, and the beginning of a darkness that no one was prepared to face. 6 in the morning on the 21st of March, 2026. The Philippine Sea was no longer a theater of active kinetic exchange, but a vast, silent graveyard where the wreckage of two empires drifted in a slow, indifferent dance across the swells. The USS Ronald Reagan was limping toward the deep-water piers of Guam at a mere 12 knots, its hull scorched by missile exhaust, and its flight deck scarred by the emergency landings of a dozen battered aircraft. To the sailors standing on the fantail, the horizon did not look like a line between sky and sea, but like an iron wall of smoke and memory that separated the world they once knew from the one they had just inherited. The air was heavy with the lingering, acrid stink of burnt plastic, the metallic tang of dried blood, and the cold, damp smell of an ocean that had swallowed the pride of two nations in less than 10 days. The silent hotline had finally rung at 4 in the morning, a digital pulse that broke a week of terrifying isolation, but the voices on both sides were hollow and stripped of their former triumphalism. There was no formal treaty signed on the deck of a battleship, no clear winner to dictate terms, and no grand strategic objective achieved by either the Pentagon or the Central Military Commission. Instead, there was only the mutual recognition of exhaustion, a realization that the industrial and human cost of continuing the conflict would lead to a total systemic collapse from which neither civilization could ever truly recover. The ceasefire was not born of a newfound desire for peace, but of a calculated, cold-blooded necessity, as both giants realized. They were bleeding out into a sea that remained entirely indifferent to their ideologies. The Iron Horizon was the name the crew gave to the debris fields that stretched for miles, composed of shattered composite wings, floating life vests, and the iridescent, rainbow-colored slicks of millions of gallons of spilled fuel. The 7th Fleet had lost 2 destroyers and a cruiser, while the Chinese Navy had seen 3 of its most advanced frigates and a nuclear submarine ground into the silt of the Philippine Trench. This was the arithmetic of modern superpower war, a subtraction of lives and treasure that added up to a global stalemate, leaving the geography of the Pacific unchanged, but the psychology of its inhabitants permanently altered. The ghost point from the first day of the conflict was now a permanent entry in the navigational charts of the world, a place where the myth of invincibility had been vaporized by a single ballistic trajectory. The soldiers of Battle Force Zulu were beyond the point of relief, their minds trapped in a repetitive loop of radar blips and damage control alarms that made the current silence feel unnatural and threatening. They moved through the ship with the slow, deliberate gait of men who had seen the end of the world and were surprised to find themselves still standing within the wreckage. Despair moved through the unit like a slow, cold current. A quiet understanding that the peace they were returning to was a fragile, temporary thing, a mere pause in a larger cycle of historical violence that was far from over. A decision made in a moment of tactical panic had cost them their innocence, leaving them to wonder if the freedom of navigation was worth the price of the ghosts that now haunted their berthing areas. Geopolitically, the map of the Indo-Pacific remained the same, yet every line drawn upon it was now a jagged wound that threatened to reopen at the slightest provocation. The South China Sea was a restricted zone of fire, a no-man's land where the commercial traffic that once fueled the global economy now moved with a terrified, halting caution, under the shadow of silent missile batteries. The two superpowers had proved they could kill each other's ships and sailors with terrifying efficiency, but they had failed to prove that either of them possessed the moral or material strength to truly rule the waves. This was the tragedy of the 21st century, a conflict where the technology was light years ahead of the wisdom required to control it, leaving the world's two greatest powers locked in a permanent, shivering embrace of mutual destruction. As the USS Ronald Reagan finally cleared the outer breakwater of Naval Station Guam, the sun broke through the heavy, gray overcast for the first time in a week, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the twisted metal of the carrier's superstructure. The admiral stood on the bridge and looked at the crowd of families waiting on the pier, realizing that he had no words to explain what had happened. In the deep purple waters to the west, he understood, with a philosophical weight that felt like iron in his chest, that this was not a victory, and it was certainly not a peace. It was merely the dead silence between reloads, a brief and hollow interval before the next coordinate was entered into a computer and the horizon was set on fire once again. The Pacific was vast and dark, a lightless abyss that had absorbed the energy of 10,000 explosions and returned only the sound of the wind. The War of the Iron Horizon had ended not with a bang, but with a weary, collective sigh of a world that was too tired to keep fighting but too proud to truly stop. The USS Ronald Reagan came to a halt, its anchors dropping into the mud with a heavy, final thud, while the ghosts of the Ghost Point remained behind, drifting forever in the currents of a sea that remembered everything and forgiven nothing.